fictional friends, and welcome to another episode of Fully Booked. I'm Meaghan.
And I'm Shirin.
And we are closing out spooky season.
Aww.
It's fine. Spooky season's all year for me. So
yeah,
it doesn't.
True.
It never
You're
really,
always a little spooky.
Yeah, it never really stops. It's just really nice to have this feeling of camaraderie during the month of October where so many people feel the same way.
One of us.
Exactly. So to close things out, we're going to talk about haunted houses. Well, we're going to talk about specifically haunted house stories.
Right.
You know, why there are so many and so many ghost stories and haunted house types of stories out there. And possibly maybe like what the deeper meaning of some, at least a portion of them could be, probably quite a few of them. I think the more you read, the more you realize there's more to it than just the idea of the house is haunted.
Oh, definitely.
Kind of, you know. Anyway, you can kind of check out all the other stuff that we've been doing for this whole month over on the website at fullybooked.ca, because we've had people covering all kinds of different occult, supernatural, paranormal stuff over there. Yeah. So feel free to head over there too and check out any other kind of recommendations or anything that you might be looking for if you don't want spooky season to be over either, because I don't.
No,
so.
we never do.
Exactly. Anyway, before we get into that, Shirin, what's on your nightstand right now?
Well, I finished reading or listening to Icebreaker. That was a trip. Yeah, I have no comments on it. It was like overly sexual, and I was just like, okay. And it's really interesting to listen to these audiobooks because you're like, tee-hee.
I read that one.
Yeah.
I feel like listening to it. I feel like listening to most of these, I can't do that because it's just going to make me be like, oh my goodness, this is so incredibly bizarre to listen to.
It is. But I did start listening to How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix.
Oh, yeah.
So right in line with what we are talking about
for
today.
Sure. And definitely feeds into what I think some of the deeper themes of some of these stories might encompass as well.
Definitely. What about you, Meaghan?
I am, well, because it's still spooky season in my heart. Anyway, I am just about to start. I was sort of in between books a little bit, but I'm just about to start Cackle by Rachel Harrison. So I'm going full witchy.
Ooh.
Yeah, two women meet and become friends, and one of them kind of realizes over time that, wow, this woman never seems to age, and she seems to have all these kinds of things at her fingertips. I wonder what that could mean.
Interesting.
This is my second Rachel Harrison book. Book I read Such Sharp Teeth last year, which is her werewolf
I remember
one.
that. Yeah.
I know she's just had a vampire story be published called Thirsty, which I just picked up. So that one's on my list too. And I haven't gone to Black Sheep yet. Anyway, I've got like 4 of her books at this point, because I really like her general style and how everything really is very female forward, which I kind of appreciate, and I find seems to be a lot more about the female relationships than maybe some of the supernatural aspects of things.
Right.
And she really weaves them together well.
I like that.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this one to kind of see how everything goes. Anyway. Haunted house stories, I guess stories of like hauntings and things like that. Obviously, I think that a lot of stories about haunted houses or properties or whatever you'd like to call it can probably, like, in a nonfiction way, can be traced back, centuries and centuries, because had even, I think there were things as early, what am I even looking at right now? I think allegedly there were writings in ancient Rome, potentially of spirits in like certain like houses or old buildings and things like that. And that's something that you do see kind of across, we talked about this with like cryptids and stuff, across like multiple cultures as well. Because, if you think about, that's it, like anywhere, like in the UK, they've got fairies, they're fairy stories.
Oh, they love their
especially
fairies.
Like in Ireland and stuff,
Yeah.
there are a lot of stories of like fairies.
Good and bad.
Good and evil, that's it, being kind of mischievous in people's houses and things like that. And my understanding is that in different Middle Eastern cultures, there have been stories about djinn potentially kind of inhabiting like old, like abandoned properties and stuff like that. Because that's what happens a lot of the time, right? Like, people make jokes so often if there's like an old abandoned house, people are like, it's probably haunted, just as an offhanded comment, which I think kind of goes to show maybe how much stories like this have kind of permeated society, like to an extent that it's kind of something that we automatically think of.
Yeah.
or like talk about right away or reference in some way.
I mean, like, if anything is like abandoned or,
Immediately, it's haunted.
It's haunted. Like, that's the only logical explanation.
Yeah, and immediately if something has been abandoned for an amount of time, there in like a town, there are always stories about a haunting or something or some like apparition that's occurred there, and people have always seen something weird and generally
or someone knows someone who's seen something.
Exactly, that's it. And I mean, even if you think of to this day, a lot of places, I'm trying to think, like a lot of like there are a lot of real places that exist that have a lot of like ghost lore and haunting lore tied to them because of the events that have occurred there, you know, and like books and stuff that have been inspired by real life alleged hauntings. Alleged. I'm going to say alleged because I'm going to reference things like Amityville, which was largely disproven, and the Lutz family essentially years later admitted that they had made up the majority of what had happened there. But that, if you think about that, obviously it inspired a novel as well as a ton of different movies and all kinds of like Amityville specific stuff. And it still stands the test of time as like, you know, one of those stories that people think of when they think of like a haunted house story.
Yeah.
And how it affected the people who were living there. And I mean, God, if you think of like real life places like the Winchester Mystery House, built by Sarah Winchester, I forget, in California, I believe, which is, she died while still adding, like having additional really bizarre kinds of like aspects of the house still built. So it's one of those that has like a lot of spooky shit tied to it, because it's like there are hallways that don't lead where you think they're going to, and they're like, she had like all kinds of like extra kind of funky stuff that she added architecturally into the house, which I think has made it a little scarier probably over time. But there are like tons of ghost sightings there.
Right.
You can stay in Massachusetts. You can stay at the Lizzie Borden house.
Oh, yes.
It's like a B&B experience essentially that you can do there. I've heard some things from some people who have stayed there who also are like, it's fucking terrifying. Like, it's very scary. Which again tied to a real life crime and stuff like that, which again I think kind of plays into the idea of negativity kind of being left behind after somebody's got a residual negative energy of some kind that could create possibly an apparition or something.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, like in literature, for example, like this is something that we always discuss is it that the house itself is haunted?
Or the people?
Or is it that there are spirits in the house?
Yeah.
Or is it the people who are in the house that are haunted? And so what about it is making it haunted?
Yeah.
And then if it's the house itself, then now you've like personified the house in a way. And now it's representative of something bigger in the story, right?
Definitely. And I mean, I think that these stories, like, you know, and why like authors are able to write such fantastic stories about haunted houses is that, I mean, home, if you think about ourselves in general as people, you know, we go to work, we go out, we do stuff, and we maybe experience some negativity in different ways, perhaps just with like strangers in a work situation and some negative interaction that we have.
Right.
But then kind of at the end of all of that, you're meant to be able to go home and be in your safe space.
Right.
That is the place where you're truly comfortable. It's supposed to be, where you can truly be yourself. That's where you go to unwind. But the addition of something like a haunting or like a negative entity of some kind creates so much tension for you, because it means that there's just no safe space for you. And I mean, even going off of that, you sleep in your house. Right. And that's like when you're at your most vulnerable.
Right. You don't want to sleep in a haunted house. Like, that's what
some people do, but
well, I mean, you know, you don't want to be in your home, you know, and
100%,
and feel unsafe. And I think that that's where so many of these great stories come from. And it's that, you know, that jarring sensation of, you know, you're reading this story and you're putting yourself in the position of that character. Yeah. And you're like, wow, I would really not want to feel this way about my house. And oftentimes it's a story of, you know, they just moved into the house.
Yes, that does happen a lot. Yeah.
Or, you know, the house, some things start happening, or it's a family home or something. Yeah. But, you know, that's kind of where these great stories come from. And it gives you that feeling. You know, it invokes a lot of emotion, these stories.
Oh, definitely. I think that, I think that so many of them are written as a way of, that's it, exercising certain traumas, possibly, and like, you know, positing the idea that the horror exists within the home,
right,
and you're not necessarily safe there.
Yeah.
However, it's maybe, again, like you were saying, like a personification, but possibly of something that is occurring for the characters,
right,
in the novel, that are like, because I find normally with these types of stories, you have to dig a little deeper and get a little further into the story to understand the root issue.
Right, because there's always a root
It's
issue.
not even necessarily the ghosts most of the time. It is whatever has possibly happened that we as the readers haven't been given access to.
Yeah.
You know, any kind of trauma that the characters have experienced or whatever, something like that. That's it. It's like, it's like one of the ultimate ways, I think, in literature that that traumas are explored. And because in these stories, there's potentially, anyway, a way to get rid of the spirits or the negativity. It's like sort of the idea of working through that trauma.
Right. And it's always a bit of an automatic outcome, right? Like, once you understand the root cause, once you understand the reason why, whether it be a ghost or whether it be whatever, you as a reader and then the characters themselves, they feel so much empathy for whatever happened that you can no longer feel scared because now there's an explanation for it.
Yeah.
And you're like, you know what? That now makes sense.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're going to continue living there, that's something else. But oftentimes it kind of closes the chapter on that haunting because, to your point, the spirit or the person has worked through their trauma and now they can essentially move on.
Yeah, because I find oftentimes like the idea of like the haunting itself, the entity, the ghost, the apparition, whatever it is often used as a way to either bring to light whatever the deeper issue is, or is being used as something to mask what the actual problem is that the character or characters are experiencing,
right,
you know,
right,
a lot of the time. And it's sort of like to kind of like hide that a little bit, but oftentimes that also brings everything to the forefront
right,
of the story eventually, which is usually how you get to like your climax. Because if I'm thinking of like in more recent years, for instance, like obviously if you trace certain aspects of that back, like it's sort of like, you know, people as like being used as like a metaphor,
right,
a metaphor for trauma and for pain and things like that. If you look at things like The Haunting of Hill House, that's something
definitely
that Shirley Jackson did a lot in her writings, and that's something that novel very much kind of brings to the forefront, is that it's more to do with the trauma and the pain of the characters as opposed to the idea of an actual haunting. That's something in Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier I find is a really good example of that, because the current Mrs. De Winter, who's not named in the novel, is spending all of her time being haunted by the idea of Rebecca, of the first wife, and what happened to her, and how maybe she feels as though she lives in this woman's shadow and she was so perfect, but there's so much more to it than that she discovers throughout the course of the story in her exploration of that, because she's not able to get any information from her husband. He won't, you know, be forthcoming with her with regards to like what occurred in their marriage, how did Rebecca die, all of those things. And so it creates this haunting kind of ghostly aspect to that story.
It's true.
But it turns out, but again, that's like a good example of like, oh, well, the house itself isn't really haunted, but he's
the people
he's
who are
haunted by his past. She's haunted by the memories that seem to plague him.
That are unknown.
Yeah, exactly. Even more, granted, like even in a more recent kind of way, if you're thinking of things like, if you're talking about like a haunting to mask the horrors that like a person is experiencing and possibly and kind of projecting onto other people, I think The Shining is a pretty good example of that, because Jack Torrance's character is so caught up in his own demons and his own fears about his alcohol addiction, and
yet they only manifest when he's in the hotel,
Exactly,
right?
because it's like the hotel gives him permission
Yeah.
to do the... Well, granted, I mean, we say that. However, at the beginning of the novel, like prior to them moving into the hotel, he has previously had outbursts due to alcohol problems.
Okay.
And I believe that he either simply injured or broke Danny's arm
I see. Okay.
in like some sort of fit that he had. And so I think that it's like he's been repressing that ever since so long in his own fears about it, that he then the hotel and its power that it has over him unfortunately brings to the forefront all of like his worst feelings about who he is as a person.
But to your point, it gives him permission
to do whatever
to be that
thing, exactly, to do those things that he doesn't, he doesn't really want to do. However, kind of like, it's sort of like your your ego, your super ego, your id kind of thing. Like, it's to like look at it from like a psychological perspective. And I mean, Stephen King wrote the novel at a time when he was a very heavily practicing alcoholic and he had a substance abuse issues for years, and he's been very candid about that. And that novel was both an exploration of his own relationship with his father, which was not a positive one, is my understanding, and also his own fears about his substance abuse and potentially the harm he could be doing to his family because of it. So all of that kind of, ties itself in, and of course, like, manifests itself in this place, because we think about it a lot of the time as like an old creaky house, but like the Shining's a little different. It's a very large, very beautiful hotel. However, it is still like a residence of sorts, and uses exactly, and uses its power to kind of manifest all that like horrible kind of destructive energy in one place.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, if you take something like the hotel from The Shining, it's almost like it's trapping the spirits in there.
It does, essentially,
because it's like feeding off of their energy, right? Yep. Whereas you have different stories where it's the spirit that is occupying the house. Like, the house itself is quite innocent. It's just like a container for whatever refuses to leave the house, right?
Yeah.
And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. The only thing coming to mind is It, which is obviously not...
I feel like it would probably be a stretch to call it like a haunted story, because it is more of like a demonic kind of entity to a degree. Because if anything, granted, I guess that because of the negativity and the dark energy that the demon creates, you could maybe, I know most people disagree, but you could stretch to the idea that the entire town of Derry is haunted.
Right. Because of that energy that it's containing.
Yes, and because when the characters are adults, as soon as they've left town, you largely forget about what has happened. They've largely forgotten about their childhoods and what they experienced at that time.
Right.
So there's a lot of that, the idea that, like, that's it when you're outside of it. So yeah, maybe it's a whole town to an extent. And that also, that darkness has created such, has such a hold over the town that it's just created this town of, particularly the adults are terrible fucking people in that story. Like, they're all horrible. Essentially, and they do nothing to, because they do nothing to help the situation. No, I'm curious to see if there's going to be any kind of exploration of any aspect of that because there's a TV show.
There's a show coming,
Welcome to Derry, I believe is coming out before the end of this year.
And is that supposed to take place before the events of It?
I think so. Okay. I think it's meant to be set like prior to everything.
It'd be interesting to see that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see that. I don't know how they're going to approach that story, because so much of it is focused on like the Losers Club, like those characters and their experience. However, it would be interesting to see possibly certain things from a more adult perspective of people who are already adults, for instance, who are experiencing this thing, not people who are like, I experienced this as a child and now.
Well, because it's different, right?
Yeah.
Like, and again, you get this in a lot of different stories of an adult experiencing either a haunted house or a haunting, where they have their own emotional baggage that comes with them, and they come in with their own trauma that they've either neglected to resolve or that they're trying to work through, versus a child who's seeing this from
a largely innocent perspective.
right.
Anyway. Yeah.
And they're able to see things a lot more clearly, which is where you get that clear definition in the story between, oh, there's clearly a ghost in here, or like, oh, the house is haunted. Like there's something wrong with the house, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
You get that in like way back to like Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen.
Yeah.
That was one of those where the house itself was haunted.
Yes.
It wasn't like a spirit or anything.
Many earlier, I think iterations were that the whole house is haunted in some way, and then that's it. You have a lot of the. I find as time goes on, you get into that manifests itself as like maybe one particular entity or multiple entities or spirits, like in The Shining, and then like I guess the most like recent haunted house book that I read. Well, so I read How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, which I would say does have a lot to do with like the trauma of resolving past issues, because you know the lead character and her brother are attempting to sell their parents' house. After they're at odds. They're trying to sell their parents' house after they've passed away, and they're both experiencing trauma by returning. In particular, she's experiencing trauma by returning to this place in which she had
stuff.
Yes,
in the house is
triggering a lot of sense memories for her and things like that. I'm not going to give away anything for you, because like obviously you're going to have to get through like the rest of it. But yeah, it's like that story certainly I would say does a lot of exploration that way. And I also read a novel last year called The September House by Carissa Orlando. That I loved. It was really wonderful. That also deals with a lot of under the surface trauma that we don't talk about, we don't deal with, that has manifested itself in multiple entities. That have experienced trauma, that were in the house previously, that experienced trauma previously, it's a really interesting story that did take like a slightly different kind of direction than I thought it was going to. But that was a really cool one to read. Also really great cover art. I don't know what it is. I just really like the cover of that book.
You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover.
Well, I do. Every day. Every day I'm like, that's a nice cover.
That's a nice cover.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting. I would say the majority of the time, I think we're all drawn to the idea of unexplained phenomenon, which is probably why we create these types of stories. And I think that we're going to continue doing that as people, either by reading them, watching them, or writing them ourselves 100%. In order to work through some of our own traumas.
Yeah, it's a good way of like explain, you know. Yeah. It's a good way of demonstrating or illustrating the impact of unresolved trauma. Yeah. And why it's important to work through that. Yep. And I think that's why we write about it so much. Because when we have something that's impacted us so much, and we just have to get it out there, however that looks, you know, in a book, for example, you know, I have to show the extent that this would have on everybody around me or even strangers, you know? So I just think that it's so interesting to have these continuously be written, because we get a different facet of it every time.
Agreed. Yeah. I love a haunted house story that's like really well written, that really explores a lot with the characters. I'm not even going to get into like something like House of Leaves. Just read it if you want to, but it's a lot. So just be aware of that. Anyway, I would love to know though, like if you guys have any like of your favorite haunted house stories, or if you like, you know, if you've like discovered maybe a love for them in recent years or something like that, like what some of like your favorites are, if you're looking forward to maybe any upcoming ones from authors that you really like. So anyway, feel free to let us know about all of that over on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads at FullyBookedCA. And you can also head over to the website and sign up for the newsletter if you want to keep getting all kinds of information from our wonderful team of contributors about all of the coverage that we're doing on a weekly basis. But until next week, guys, and a whole new set of things to talk about, keep on reading.
Thanks, everyone.